Well, President Trump not going into detail about his strategy for dealing with North Korea. During an interview with the Reuters news agency yesterday, Mr. Trump says he's not ruling out diplomacy despite failed attempts in the past. The president saying, "I'm not sure that talks will lead to anything meaningful. They've talked for 25 years and they've taken advantage of our presidents, of our previous presidents." He goes on to say, "We're playing a very, very hard game of poker and you don't want to reveal your hand." Joining us now, retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. He's also a senior fellow and military expert for defense priorities. Thanks, sir, for being here. There is this notion going around Washington that perhaps you could undertake a limited military strike against North Korea, a so-called bloody nose strike, to paralyze some, element of their infrastructure or their military capability and show them what we are capable of. What do you think of that notion?
Well, let me just tell you flat out, first of all, there will be no war on the Korean Peninsula unless we start one with some kind of preventive action like this attempt at a bloody nose, because it will not work. I mean, look, there is no doubt in anyone's mind on the planet that we have the ability 100 times over to destroy North Korea. So there's no need to do a bloody nose strike to show them that. They already know that.
So then why is Kim Jong-un being so belligerent and threatening, to inflame the United States in a sea of fire, for instance?
Well, I think we have to be very careful to examine exactly what he is saying and look at the reasons why. He is not using, he is not intending to use his military, his nuclear power in order to threaten the United States in terms of an offensive operation. He has been very clear on numerous levels, both in diplomatic and otherwise, that says he wants this as a deterrent. He wants this to prevent the United States from attacking him. And I think that's part of our problem, is that I think we have the idea that he's trying to get this capability so we can attack the United States. And there's no evidence that he would be willing to do that, which is why diplomacy and continuing to talk is so critical, because we don't want to start the very war that we claim we're trying to prevent.
But this president and others have said they will never allow a nuclearized North Korea.
They have said that, and I hope that they would set a different objective, because that's not one that's valid in terms of the reasons to go to war. You go to war because you're literally being threatened with attacks. For example, if we had even intelligence that said he was preparing to launch a weapon against the United States, that's a valid reason to, in that case, use preemptive war. But if he's not going to attack the United States, I mean, just having a capability is not a reason to go to war, because we have to understand, you wouldn't succeed at taking away his capability. You would just cause him to use it. And that harms our own interests, and we can't do that.
North Korea and South Korea have been holding talks. Some have suggested that the South Koreans are sort of allowing themselves to be taken advantage of and driving a wedge between our country and theirs. What do you think?
Yeah, they're not. Nobody on the planet has more incentive for this to be resolved in diplomatic, political, and non-lethal ways than South Korea, because they would suffer more than anyone if this turns into a war. But concurrently, they also recognize that the United States has been their closest ally, and the reason possibly why there hadn't been any conflict since 1953, when the armistice was signed. So the idea that they would put a wedge between us and side with North Korea over us is just not realistic. And I think you see even within their own internal politics in the last couple of days that there's plenty of people that say, hey, they're very angry at North Korea and said, hey, we're not going to go too far down this road here, because we recognize that our future lies with the protection of the United States and not with North Korea.
Interesting perspective. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. Thank you.
America is apparently ready for war with North Korea. That from our Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, who warned that if Kim Jong-un and company do not agree to enter negotiations to give up their nuclear weapons, the U.S. military is going to drop the hammer. It's a sobering statement delivered at a 20-nation summit in Canada designed to show the communist regime that the world has had it up to here, our northern border that needs a wall. The problem is Russia and China, well, they weren't invited, as they are rumored partners with North Korea. So there's not total solidarity, but what were you expecting? There is a bright spot amongst all of the dark talk of Armageddon. North and South Korea joining together for the Olympics. The peninsula will march together at the opening ceremony of the Olympic Winter Games and team up for a few sports as well. So does any of this show real promise for peace? or is it just delaying the inevitable? Joining me now, my friend Brian Suits, KFI radio host and an Iraq combat war veteran. Welcome back to the show, Brian.
Thank you for having me.
You are so welcome. And I point back at you, friend. So let's talk about this a little bit, because it appears that for most of the Young administration, Rex Tillerson has played good cop on North Korea. This is a lot tougher talk from him. Does this symbolize a shift in the administration, or are we really on a death march?
Well, it's almost like they took the old good cop, bad cop routine, and yesterday it morphed into less bad cop and bad cop, because it's almost like he's a front man for the Pentagon at this point. It looks like by getting the old band back together from the 1950 original Korean War, Revenge of the Sith, that it looks more like we're getting consent, like we're getting public consent from the prior participants on the UN side. Recall, because that there's no peace treaty.
Yeah.
That's still an ongoing situation. China and Russia, of course, were the primary allies of North Korea, so of course they're not going to get invited to Vancouver.
Well, that's sad, because it's a lovely city, particularly this time of year. And now the president is saying that where China has pulled back, helping and appeasing North Korea, skirting some of these sanctions, Russia has picked up the filthy slack. Is that true? And that doesn't seem like they're being very helpful at all, especially for being our puppet master.
It is absolutely true. People who don't have a fine enough map of North Korea may not know this, but at the far east end of the Korean-Chinese border is about 20 kilometers of North Korean-Russian border. And the Russians have reinforced that area of the border. It's probably one of the most heavily reconnoitered areas by the U.S. Of the earth right now. And yes, the Russians are taking North Korean coal out, which are not supposed to be, and large tarp-covered trucks are going into North Korea. So it's not it doesn't take a genius or a satellite to know this.
No, and they're reinforcing it with whole wheat crackers and ham sandwiches and the like. That may be a metaphor for something else. So, Suits, let me ask you this, because there's a lot of talk, because obviously no one wants a protracted war. No one wants a 17-year conflict on the Korean Peninsula. The South Koreans don't want it. I hope the North Koreans don't want it. Chinese don't want it. We certainly don't want it. But there's talk of something called a bloody nose. Explain what that is, because everyone nods and goes, oh, yeah, bloody nose, totally. But I think people really have no idea what it means, including myself.
The notion would be that we would conduct a strike so limited that none of the actual airstrikes would originate from South Korea or Japan. And so that would give them, a moral cover to say, don't retaliate on us, that everything would happen from Guam and Okinawa, which is still Japan, and that it would be a 5 or 6 night or day and night strike, including possible use of ground troops in North Korea to absolutely, utterly destroy their nuclear and missile infrastructure. And then the threat would be, if you retaliate, you're going to make it a bigger war, and you're not going to want that. And the notion that the North Koreans would just sit back and let somebody invade them for 5 days is, I think, amazingly naive. But the U.S. military's job is to be ready for every contingency.
Yeah.
So that's why they've been doing paratrooper drops in Nevada after a 4-hour flight from North Carolina, 4 to 5 hours. It simulates roughly getting on the plane in Guam and then dropping on North Korea. And so that's the bloody nose, is just give them a 5-day bloody nose and actually think that this regime would sit back and go, you know what, we're gonna hire a life coach and rethink our choices.
They're probably going to do that, because life coaches are very, very popular in Pyongyang. So we only have about 30 seconds left. What is the cost to us and to the world for North Korea keeping their nuclear weapons program?
Allowing a wacky regime to have nuclear leverage on anything they choose to use it for. Inclusion in the Olympics, drop the letter B from the English language. I mean, if this is not a rational actor, and it's not like Pakistan, India, or U.S., USSR. Yeah. This is a regime that starved its own people to gain nuclear weapons, and you're telling me they wouldn't use it for every international dispute as leverage? It's crazy. Yeah,
they hurt and kill the people they purport to love most. So why wouldn't they use those weapons of mass destruction to kill people they actually hate, meaning us? Point well taken, Brian Suits. Thank you for being here. Always good to see you.
Good to see you.
Good to be
Camera.
Yeah, I like it.
element of their infrastructure or their military capability and show them what we are capable of. What do you think of that notion?
Well, let me just tell you flat out, first of all, there will be no war on the Korean Peninsula unless we start one with some kind of preventive action like this attempt at a bloody nose, because it will not work. I mean, look, there is no doubt.
Well, President Trump not going into detail about his strategy for dealing with North Korea. During an interview with the Reuters news agency yesterday, Mr. Trump says he's not ruling out diplomacy despite failed attempts in the past. The president saying, Davis, he's also a senior fellow and military expert for defense priorities. Thanks, sir, for being here. There is this notion going around Washington that perhaps you could undertake a limited military strike against North Korea, a so-called bloody nose strike, to paralyze some,
doubt in anyone's mind on the planet that we have the ability 100 times over to destroy North Korea. So there's no need to do a bloody nose strike to show them that. They already know that.
So then why is Kim Jong-un being so belligerent and threatening, to inflame the... I'm not sure that talks will lead to anything meaningful. They've talked for 25 years and they've taken advantage of our presidents, of our previous presidents. He goes on to say, we're playing a very, very hard game of poker and you don't want to reveal your hand. Joining us now, retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Daniel